It was 3 a.m. when the sound of splintering wood shattered the stillness of the night. A team of armed officers stormed through the front door of a quiet suburban home, shouting commands and sweeping through the darkened rooms. Their target, a suspected criminal, was nowhere to be found. Instead, standing in her robe, terrified and confused, was a black woman who also happened to be a federal prosecutor. What began as a supposed high-stakes police operation was about to spiral into a national controversy that exposed deep flaws in law enforcement oversight, accountability, and racial bias. The night was quiet, the kind of calm that settles over a neighborhood when everyone has long since gone to bed. Streetlights hummed faintly, casting pale yellow circles over empty sidewalks. Inside one modest suburban home, a woman named Angela Porter was asleep, her phone charging by the nightstand, the soft rhythm of her breathing matching the quiet stillness around her. At precisely 3 a.m., that peace shattered. The sound of a battering ram colliding with her front door echoed like a gunshot. Before she could even open her eyes fully, she heard the crash of boots and the bark of commands filling her hallway. "Police! Search warrant!" someone yelled, followed by the sound of glass breaking. Angela's heart pounded violently in her chest as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Still disoriented from sleep, she stumbled out of bed, her mind racing with confusion and fear. For a moment, she thought it must be some kind of mistake, a nightmare that didn't feel real. But when she saw the flashlights slicing through the dark, the sight of armored figures moving through her home, she realized this was no dream. The officers moved with mechanical precision, weapons drawn, sweeping through rooms with the urgency of people convinced they were closing in on danger. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled open, and the clatter of objects hitting the floor filled the air. Angela froze at the foot of the stairs, her hands instinctively rising in surrender, even though she had no idea what she was surrendering for. A voice shouted at her to get down, and she obeyed, dropping to her knees on the cold hardwood floor. The bright beam of a tactical flashlight hit her face, blinding her, followed by the metallic sound of handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists. Her mind screamed that this had to be some horrible mix-up, that any second now they would realize who she was. But the officers didn't pause. They treated her like any other suspect, barking questions, demanding answers, searching for a name she didn't recognize. As she tried to speak, her voice shook. "I'm a federal prosecutor," she said, her words barely audible under the chaos. But they didn't stop. One officer told her to stay quiet. Another kept his gun trained on her as others continued tearing through her home. The surrealness of the moment pressed on her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. Just hours earlier, she had been preparing notes for a major case, one involving police misconduct. Now, she was face down in her own living room, surrounded by officers who didn't even seem to know who they were arresting. The confusion stemmed from a warrant issued for a suspect who supposedly lived at her address. A clerical error, a data mix-up, a misread document somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery. Someone had made a mistake, and that mistake led to the violent invasion of an innocent woman's home. The officers, relying on the information fed to them, never questioned it. They kicked in her door with full confidence, certain they were acting on solid intelligence. But as minutes turned to agonizing eternity, as they realized there were no signs of criminal activity, no drugs, no weapons, no fugitive hiding in the shadows, the atmosphere shifted. The confidence began to erode, replaced by hesitant glances and murmured confusion. One of the younger officers checked the warrant again, comparing it to Angela's driver's license left on the kitchen counter. His face went pale. The commanding officer's voice cracked slightly as he asked for confirmation over the radio. The response came back quickly, low and uncertain. They had the wrong person, the wrong house, the wrong everything. Angela sat on the floor, still handcuffed, watching as realization rippled through the room. The energy that had fueled their aggression moments earlier was replaced by an awkward, almost painful silence. No one knew what to say. The same hands that had forced her to the ground now fumbled with the cuffs, trying to remove them as gently as possible. She could see the embarrassment, the panic, the disbelief in their eyes, but none of it erased the fear she had felt, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in her own home. When they finally stepped back, trying to apologize, she didn't respond. Her hands trembled as she rubbed her wrists, the red marks stark against her skin. The house around her was a wreck, papers scattered, furniture broken, picture frames cracked. The same home that once represented safety and comfort now felt violated, alien. As she tried to steady her breathing, her mind replayed the moment the door burst open. The shouts, the lights, the overwhelming sense that her life could have ended in seconds. She thought about the many stories she had read. Black men and women killed in raids gone wrong, and realized how close she had come to being one of them. It didn't take long for her colleagues to find out. Within hours, the district attorney's office was buzzing with outrage. Calls were made, reports demanded, explanations sought. How could a mistake of this magnitude happen? How could a federal prosecutor, someone whose name and address were on government records, be wrongfully targeted in a police raid? The department scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing statements about procedural errors and unfortunate miscommunication. But the story spread quickly, fueled by disbelief and anger. The media descended on her neighborhood, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Neighbors watched from their windows as Angela, still shaken, stood outside trying to answer questions she herself didn't yet understand. The more details emerged, the clearer it became that this was not an isolated error, but part of a larger pattern, a system too reliant on flawed data, too desensitized to the human consequences of its mistakes. The police had conducted the raid with confidence because they were trained to trust the process, not question it, but in trusting blindly, they had turned that process into a weapon. Angela's professional identity only deepened the irony. She had spent years working within the justice system, defending its integrity, arguing for accountability and reform. Now she had experienced firsthand the very kind of violation she once sought to prevent. Her story quickly became a rallying point. Civil rights advocates demanded justice. Legal experts dissected the procedural failures, and politicians used it as a case study for systemic flaws in law enforcement practices. But for Angela, beneath the public noise, there was only exhaustion. The experience had left her shaken to her core, not just because of the violence of the raid, but because of what it revealed: how easily power could be misused, how fragile safety could be, how quickly authority could turn ordinary citizens into suspects. The image of the officers' faces, the echo of the door breaking, the flash of the flashlight in her eyes, these moments replayed in her mind, refusing to fade. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw them again, felt the adrenaline surge through her body, the helplessness of not being believed even when she stated who she was. Days later, she would learn that the suspect they were looking for had moved out months ago. A simple clerical update never made it into the system, and no one cross-checked the records. It was a small mistake, the kind that happens every day in overburdened bureaucracies. But this one had nearly cost a woman her life. For the officers, it was an accident. For Angela, it was a trauma that would linger long after the news cycle moved on. When the news broke that the police had raided the home of a federal prosecutor at 3 a.m, the first question on everyone's mind was simple: how could this happen? But as the details unfolded, that question evolved into something much deeper. Why did it happen the way it did? Beneath the surface of mistaken addresses and procedural errors lay an uncomfortable truth that had echoed through countless other stories before this one. Racial bias and systemic negligence within law enforcement were not anomalies. They were habits. They were woven into the way the system operated, influencing decisions, responses, and outcomes, often without those in power even realizing it. The raid on Angela Porter's home wasn't just an unfortunate accident. It was a symptom of a much larger and more entrenched problem that had persisted for decades. From the moment the police department planned the operation, implicit assumptions guided their actions. The warrant listed a black suspect. The address was located in a predominantly black neighborhood, and the urgency of the operation was amplified by the presumption of danger. These assumptions are rarely stated out loud, but they shape how officers are briefed, how they approach a situation, and how much restraint they exercise. Studies and data over the years have shown that police are statistically more likely to use force, act aggressively, or execute no-knock raids when the suspects are black. It's not just about individual prejudice, it's about conditioning. Generations of policing culture have taught officers to associate blackness with criminality, and those ingrained perceptions often guide their split-second decisions. In Angela's case, this bias manifested in the tone of the operation. The officers arrived heavily armed, ready for confrontation, treating the home as a threat before even confirming who lived there. The neighborhood wasn't one known for crime, yet the tactics used mirrored those typically deployed in high-risk arrests. The decision to kick in the door rather than knock, the immediate escalation to shouting commands, and the aggressive posture, all reflected a prejudgment rooted in stereotype rather than evidence. Even after Angela identified herself as a federal prosecutor calmly, clearly, and repeatedly, it took them far too long to believe her. Her word carried no weight in that moment because her appearance contradicted the image of authority. The officers were conditioned to recognize, to them, she didn't look like someone who could hold power within the system they served. This interaction exposed something more insidious than overt racism. It showed how institutional bias creates a culture where disbelief and suspicion of black individuals become reflexive. The officers didn't necessarily set out that night intending to target a black woman unjustly. They operated within a system that normalized those outcomes. Their training, policies, and environment rewarded quick action over thoughtful verification. And in that environment, race often determined who received the benefit of the doubt. The negligence wasn't just in misreading a document, it was in failing to question the assumptions that led them there in the first place. Once the raid hit the media, public reaction split sharply. Some immediately called it an egregious act of racial profiling, while others framed it as an unfortunate mistake. But those defending the police missed the core issue. Mistakes like these didn't happen in a vacuum. They were part of a repeating pattern. Every few months, headlines appeared about officers raiding the wrong homes, shooting unarmed civilians, or detaining innocent people, and disproportionately. Those victims were people of color. The names changed, the cities changed, but the script remained eerily familiar. The system kept reproducing the same outcomes because the underlying structure rewarded the same flawed behavior. Inside the department, the response followed a predictable path. Internal Affairs opened an investigation. Supervisors issued statements about protocol reviews, and the officers involved were temporarily placed on desk duty. Behind closed doors, however, there was little acknowledgement of the racial dynamics at play. For many within law enforcement, to admit racial bias was to admit moral failure, and that discomfort led to denial. Instead of confronting the systemic roots of the problem, DEPARTMENTS leaned on procedural language, human error, incorrect intelligence, miscommunication. These terms sounded neutral, bureaucratic, and unthreatening, but they obscured the real human cost. They reduced an act of violence and violation into a paperwork problem. Angela, on the other hand, understood exactly what had happened. Having spent years working within the justice system, she had seen the bias from the other side in jury selections, in charging decisions, in sentencing disparities, but experiencing it personally revealed how deeply entrenched it truly was. Her skin color had shaped the officer's perception of her before she even opened her mouth. Even her credentials, her authority, her position as a federal prosecutor couldn't shield her from that initial judgment. It was a stark reminder that no level of education, status, or accomplishment could fully insulate a black person from the prejudices that defined the American justice system. The racial undertones of the raid drew comparisons to other infamous cases, Taylor's death during a botched no-knock raid, or the countless stories of mistaken identity that ended in tragedy. Though Angela survived, her story reignited those wounds in the public consciousness. Activists pointed to her case as proof that the system's problems weren't limited to bad apples or isolated mistakes. They were systemic, baked into the structure, through years of policy decisions that disproportionately targeted black communities under the guise of public safety. As the public debate grew, experts in criminal justice began dissecting the procedural chain that led to the raid, the flawed warrant process, the lack of verification protocols, the unchecked use of force. All of it painted a picture of systemic negligence. But more importantly, the conversation turned toward the racial element that underpinned it all. Why were such errors overwhelmingly directed toward certain demographics? Why did the presumption of guilt seem to fall so easily on black Americans, regardless of their profession or achievements? These questions didn't have simple answers, but they forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths. The psychological impact of racial bias on both sides of the badge was also discussed. Officers operating under constant narratives of fear and danger became desensitized, developing tunnel vision that filtered their perception through race-based expectations. Meanwhile, communities of color internalized the constant threat of being misjudged or mistreated, living with an awareness that even compliance could not guarantee safety. Angela's experience encapsulated that dual tension perfectly. A law enforcer, who became the target of the very system she helped uphold, her case sparked internal reflection among some in the justice community. Judges, prosecutors, and police chiefs who had long defended the system began questioning how such an incident could slip through their safeguards. But change, as always, came slowly. Policy reviews were promised, diversity training sessions were scheduled, and public statements emphasized learning opportunities. Yet for Angela and many others, these gestures felt hollow. The problem wasn't just a lack of education, it was a lack of accountability. Without genuine structural reform, the cycle would continue. The negligence within the force wasn't only operational, it was moral. It lay in the failure to recognize the humanity of those they were sworn to protect. The ease with which the officers stormed her home, the way they dismissed her identity, the delay in offering an apology, all of it stemmed from an ingrained system that treated some lives as inherently more suspicious, more expendable. The law, in theory, was colorblind, but in practice, it had eyes that saw race first and humanity second. For Angela, that realization was devastating. It fractured her belief in the institution she had dedicated her career to defending. The raid forced her to confront a painful paradox that the justice system she worked within was capable of inflicting injustice with alarming precision. She knew that her story would make headlines for a few days, maybe weeks, but she also knew that without deep introspection and reform, nothing would truly change. The negligence that led to her raid was not an isolated mistake. It was the natural outcome of a system conditioned to act first and question later, especially when the face on the other side of the door was black. The aftermath of the wrongful raid on Angela Porter's home unfolded like a slow-burning storm that refused to fade. What began as a horrifying personal ordeal soon evolved into a public reckoning that exposed cracks in the justice system far wider than anyone had anticipated. In the days following the raid, media outlets swarmed her quiet neighborhood, turning her house into a symbol of systemic failure. Headlines framed her story as a chilling example of law enforcement overreach, while public outrage spread across social media, igniting conversations about accountability, privilege, and race in America. Angela's face became familiar across news broadcasts, not as a prosecutor or a government official, but as the woman whose life had been appended by those sworn to uphold the law. At first, The police department tried to control the narrative. They issued a statement calling the raid an unfortunate error, citing a misfiled address and flawed intelligence. But the explanation did little to calm the outrage. People were not angry simply because of the mistake. They were furious because this mistake felt far too familiar. It echoed countless other cases where black families had been wrongfully targeted, homes invaded, or lives lost over procedural missteps. This time, however, the victim wasn't an anonymous name. She was part of the very system that had failed her. The contrast was too glaring to ignore. A woman who prosecuted criminals for a living had been treated like one by the very institution she served. That irony struck a national nerve. Angela herself was reluctant to speak at first. She was still processing the trauma, still waking up in the middle of the night to phantom sounds of breaking doors. Her hands would shake when she passed police vehicles on the road. But as the story grew larger, silence became impossible. Pressure mounted from colleagues, journalists, and community leaders urging her to share her experience publicly. When she finally agreed to sit for an interview, her calm but resolute tone carried weight. She didn't speak with anger or vengeance. She spoke with clarity. She described the terror, the disbelief, the humiliation of being handcuffed in her own home. Her words painted a picture of a system that had lost its moral compass, one where power operated unchecked and accountability existed only in theory. The interview went viral overnight. Millions watched clips of her recounting the events, her voice steady but eyes weary. Her story resonated beyond racial or political lines because it exposed a truth many had sensed but few could articulate, that the machinery of law enforcement had become too powerful, too insulated from consequence. The fact that even a federal prosecutor could be subjected to such treatment raised uncomfortable questions about how ordinary citizens fared in similar situations. If someone with her status and connections could be violated so easily, what chance did the average person have? Public pressure grew relentless. Protests erupted in front of the police headquarters, demanding justice and reform. Activist groups seized the moment, calling for stricter oversight of search warrants, an end to no-knock raids, and mandatory accountability measures for officers involved in wrongful actions. The department found itself under investigation by both the city and federal authorities, forced to explain not only how the raid happened, but why it took so long for anyone to question it. Within weeks, high-ranking officials began resigning or being reassigned, and internal documents revealed that the warrant had been signed off with minimal verification. The revelations only deepened the outrage. What was supposed to be an isolated mistake now looked like the product of a careless culture that valued speed and aggression over diligence and humanity. Meanwhile, Angela became an unwilling figurehead for a growing movement. Civil rights advocates reached out, inviting her to speak at conferences, legal panels, and community events. Though hesitant, she began to see that her story had the power to fuel meaningful change. When she stood before audiences, she spoke not just about her own experience, but about the countless others who didn't have the same platform to tell theirs. She reminded people that accountability wasn't just about punishing officers. It was about rebuilding trust between communities and the institutions meant to serve them. Each appearance brought standing ovations, but behind her composed exterior lingered the emotional toll of reliving that night. Again and again, the legal battle that followed turned into a national spectacle. Angela filed a civil lawsuit against the department, not for personal compensation, but to force systemic reform. The case drew extensive coverage, exposing procedural negligence and a pattern of unchecked authority. During court proceedings, body cam footage of the raid was played publicly for the first time. The footage was harrowing, the violent entry, the shouted commands, Angela's terrified voice insisting she was a federal prosecutor, and the officers' dismissive reactions. Watching it, the courtroom fell silent. The footage didn't just prove the misconduct, it humanized the experience in a way that no written report ever could. It was undeniable evidence of how flawed assumptions and lack of restraint could destroy someone's sense of safety in seconds. The department's defense leaned on familiar rhetoric that the officers were following procedure, that the error originated from faulty intelligence, that they acted in good faith under the information available. But the public had grown weary of those explanations. The idea of good faith had become a hollow shield protecting systemic negligence from accountability. Commentators across media platforms questioned how a system could continue to rely on procedures that so consistently produced injustice. Politicians, sensing the shifting tide, began proposing legislative reforms. Bills were introduced to tighten oversight on warrants, require multi-level verification, and impose penalties for raids executed on wrong addresses. What had started as a single raid now rippled into the national policy arena, forcing long-avoided conversations about how much unchecked power law enforcement should wield. Amid the legal and political chaos, Angela's personal life bore the brunt of it. Friends described her as quieter, more withdrawn, often lost in thought. She still went to work, still argued cases, but her belief in the system had fractured. The same institutions she once trusted now felt alien, tainted by hypocrisy. Yet paradoxically, her ordeal gave her a new sense of purpose. She began working on criminal justice reform initiatives, using her platform to advocate for changes in police accountability, transparency, and data accuracy. What had been meant to silence her only amplified her voice. As months passed, the national outrage began to fade, as it always does. New scandals and tragedies filled the headlines, pushing her story gradually out of the spotlight. But its impact lingered. Several states passed reforms inspired by her case, and police departments across the country reviewed their warrant execution protocols. The conversation she had sparked didn't end. It evolved, carried forward by activists and lawmakers determined to ensure no one else endured what she had. For the officers involved, disciplinary action varied. Some were demoted, others quietly resigned, and a few managed to return to duty after mandatory retraining. The chief of police eventually issued a formal apology to Angela, though it came months too late and sounded rehearsed. Still, she accepted it with grace, understanding that genuine change would come not from words, but from sustained action. The scars, both emotional and psychological, remained. Every time she heard a loud knock at her door, her heart would race. Every police siren reminded her of how fragile safety truly was. What set Angela's story apart was not just the injustice she endured, but the scale of reflection it provoked. For once, America had to look at its justice system through the eyes of someone inside it, someone who had upheld the law, only to become a victim of its failures. Her case dismantled the comforting illusion that authority guaranteed fairness, showing instead that power without accountability could easily turn destructive. The national outrage it sparked became a mirror reflecting society's long-ignored truths about race, privilege, and justice. And while policies could change, the deeper transformation, the one that required empathy, humility, and institutional courage, was still just beginning.